Look at your mind for a moment. That peculiar stream of thoughts flowing through your awareness right now. The commentary that never stops, that judges everything, even these words I'm sharing with you. Have you ever paused to wonder who exactly is doing all this talking in your head? I find it rather amusing that most of us spend our entire lives listening to this internal monologue without ever questioning its source. We simply assume that's me thinking and carry on. But is it really? Are you creating these thoughts, or are they simply arising in you, like clouds forming in the sky? And if that voice is truly you, then who is the one listening to it? Who is aware of these thoughts? Isn't that awareness also you? This paradox, the speaker and the listener seemingly existing in the same mind, points to something quite extraordinary about the nature of consciousness itself. Today, let's explore this magnificent puzzle together, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as an invitation to discover something fundamental about your existence, something that might just transform how you experience every moment of your life. Let us begin with something you're experiencing right now. As you're hearing these words, there's a voice in your head that's following along, isn't there? Perhaps it's repeating what I'm saying, or perhaps it's commenting on it. Yes, that's true. Or, I'm not sure about that, or even, I wonder where he's going with this. Now, here's the peculiar thing. If you pay very close attention to this voice, you'll notice something rather odd. You cannot predict with certainty what this voice is going to say next. If you could, there would be no point in its speaking, would there? It's rather like reading a novel. If you already knew every word on every page, the act of reading would be utterly superfluous. And yet, we have the strongest sensation that this voice is me. I am thinking, we say. But am I doing the thinking, or is thinking happening to me? You see, we have this extraordinary assumption that because thoughts occur in your head, they must be yours, that you are creating them, like a spider spinning a web. But when you truly look for the thinker, the one who supposedly initiates each thought, you find yourself in a very curious position indeed. Try it for yourself right now. Try to think your next thought. What will it be? You don't know, do you? Until it appears. And by the time you know what your next thought will be, it's already happened. So who exactly is doing the thinking? We might say, the brain is thinking much as the heart is beating or the lungs are breathing. But we don't say, I am beating my heart, or I am breathing my lungs, at least not unless we're consciously controlling our breath. No, we recognize that these are processes happening within us, largely autonomously. What if thinking is exactly the same? What if thoughts arise in consciousness much as waves arise from the ocean, not separate from it, but a movement of the whole, is less than #0? 5# is greater than. The inner voice, you see, is not so much your creation as it is a process you're witnessing. And this voice has been shaped by everything you've ever experienced, your parents, your education, books you've read, conversations you've had, the very culture you've grown up in. So when the voice speaks of I, of me, of myself, what is it really referring to? Is it referring to the true you, or merely to a character it's been rehearsing all your life? A fascinating question, isn't it? Now this brings us to what I consider one of the most extraordinary illusions of human existence. The way we've come to mistake this inner narrator for our very self. You see, from the moment we learn language, we're taught a most peculiar game. We're given a name and told, you are John, or you are Mary, as if this collection of sensations, feelings, and experiences could be contained in a single word. And gradually, through the years, we build up a story. I was born on such and such a date to these parents, in this place. I went to this school. I have these talents and these failings. I am this sort of person. And the voice in our head becomes the narrator of this story, constantly updating our biography, constantly telling us who we are. I'm the kind of person who likes jazz but can't stand opera. I'm not very good at mathematics. I'm rather sensitive about my appearance. On and on it goes, weaving this fictional character that we take to be ourselves. But, you see, this is a case of mistaken identity of the most profound kind. It's rather like going to the theater and becoming so absorbed in the play that you forget you're watching actors. You temporarily believe in the reality of Hamlet or Ophelia, but in this case the play has been going on so long your entire life that you've utterly forgotten it's a performance. This separate self, this ego as we call it in the West, or what Buddhists call the Maya, the illusion it isn't actually an entity at all. It's a process. It's something your organism is doing, not something your organism is. Consider, when you say I think or I feel, what exactly is this I that thinks and feels? If you try to point to it, what can you point to? Your body. But your body is constantly changing. Every 7 years or so, practically every cell is replaced. Your memories. But these too change, some fade. Some are embellished. Some are entirely fabricated without your realizing it. What remains constant? Only this sense of I, this center of narrative gravity that the voice in your head continuously refers to. But when you look for it directly, it's like trying to catch your own shadow. The closer you get, the more it recedes. And yet, desperately we cling to it. How terrified we are at the prospect of losing this sense of self. We call it depersonalization or ego death and consider it pathological. But what if it's the clinging to this illusion that's the true pathology? You see, the separate self is useful as a social convention, rather like money. We all agree to pretend it exists because it makes certain interactions possible. But the trouble begins when we mistake the convention for reality. When we begin to believe that this I, this inner voice, is our authentic being. It's rather like the image of yourself in a mirror, useful for combing your hair, but you wouldn't try to feed it breakfast, would you? Yet in a sense that's exactly what we do with this conceptual self. We spend our lives trying to satisfy its endless demands, to live up to its impossible standards, to defend it against imagined slights. What would happen, I wonder, if we stopped mistaking the voice for the true self? If we recognized it as merely one function of consciousness among many, perhaps something far more interesting than our familiar inner narrator might reveal itself. There's a most peculiar paradox at the heart of this inquiry. When you attempt to observe the voice in your head, to watch your own thoughts as they arise, who exactly is doing the watching? It seems there's an observer standing apart from the thoughts, doesn't it? But if you look closely at this observer, you'll notice something extraordinary. It too becomes an object of observation. It's rather like trying to bite your own teeth or see your own eyes without a mirror. The Western philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein put it beautifully when he said, "The eye that sees is not itself in the field of vision. You see everything except the seeing itself." And yet, the seeing is happening, isn't it? The Hindus have a wonderful term for this. They call it the witness, or in Sanskrit, sakshi. This witnessing presence that is aware of everything, including your thoughts, but cannot itself be turned into an object of awareness. It's always the subject, never the object. Now, here's where things get truly fascinating. In the West, we've been conditioned to believe that consciousness is something the brain produces, rather like the liver produces bile. It's an epiphenomenon, a side effect of neural activity. But this explanation has always struck me as backwards. It's like saying that a television set creates the programs you watch. No, the television receives signals and translates them into images and sounds. What if the brain is more like a receiver than a producer? What if consciousness is not something the brain creates, but something it tunes into? The Vedantic philosophers of India have long maintained that consciousness is not a product, but the fundamental ground of being. They call it Brahman, or sometimes Atman, when referring to its expression in individual beings. It's not something you have, but what you are at the most fundamental level. Consider this. When you're deeply absorbed in a beautiful sunset, or in making love, or in a piece of music, those moments when the chattering voice momentarily falls silent, does your consciousness disappear? No. In fact, it becomes more vivid, more immediate, more real. The commentary stops, but the awareness remains, doesn't it? This suggests something quite revolutionary, that the true nature of consciousness might not be the inner voice at all, but the aware space in which the voice appears. Not the thoughts, but the knowing of the thoughts. But here we encounter another delicious paradox, because as soon as you try to grasp this pure awareness, to hold it and examine it, it slips away. The very act of trying to observe it turns it into an object, which it can never be. It's rather like trying to see darkness with a flashlight. The moment you shine the light, the darkness vanishes. You can never catch it. And yet, darkness exists, doesn't it? This is why I've always been amused by the philosophical problem of solipsism, the worry that one can never prove the existence of other minds. The real puzzle is that one cannot even prove the existence of one's own mind, at least not as an object of study. So you see, when we ask, "Who is speaking in my head?" we're falling into a trap. We're assuming that consciousness is a thing, a noun, when perhaps it's better understood as a process, a verb. Not a thinker who thinks, but thinking itself. Not a seer who sees, but seeing itself. Not a hearer who hears, but hearing itself. And the greatest joke of all is that what you truly are is not a separate entity trying to understand consciousness, but consciousness itself playing at being a separate entity. Let's now consider something rather remarkable about this voice in our heads. Have you noticed that it speaks in a language? English, perhaps, or French, or Japanese, whatever tongue you were taught as a child. And language, you see, is inherently social. It's a system of communication between people. What this suggests is something quite profound. The voice in your head, this supposedly private phenomenon, is actually social in its very structure. You're talking to yourself in exactly the same way others once talked to you. When a child is learning to tie their shoelaces, the parent says, "First, take this lace over that one, then pull it under and through the loop." Later the child will repeat these same instructions to themselves as they learn the skill. Over, under, through the loop. Eventually they no longer need the verbal instructions, but that inner dialogue was essential in the learning process. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky called this inner speech, and recognized that it begins as outer speech, as actual conversations with others that we gradually internalize. Your inner voice, in other words, is a chorus of all the voices you've ever heard, all the instructions you've been given, all the judgments that have been passed on you. Have you ever noticed that your inner critic often sounds suspiciously like a parent or a teacher from your childhood? That's not a coincidence. It literally is their voice, absorbed into your psyche. And it's not just individual voices we internalize, but entire cultural patterns of thought. If you were raised in a Western society, your inner voice is likely analytical, categorizing, dividing the world into subjects and objects. If you were raised in traditional Japan or China, it might be more relational, more attuned to context and connection. The ancient Greeks had no concept of conscience as we understand it today, that inner voice that tells you right from wrong. Instead, they believed that the gods spoke directly to them. A Greek warrior might say, "Athena whispered in my ear that I should spare this man." Today we'd say, "My conscience told me to spare him." Same phenomenon, entirely different interpretation. What I find fascinating is that we've internalized not just specific voices, but an entire model of what it means to be a self. In the West, this model is heavily influenced by Christianity, with its emphasis on the individual soul, and by Descartes, with his famous "I think, therefore I am." We've been taught to identify with our thoughts, to believe that thinking is the core of our being. But this is a cultural bias, not a universal truth. In many Eastern traditions, the true self is found in the silence beneath thought, in the space between words. As the Zen saying goes, the mind is like a monkey jumping from branch to branch. The goal is not to identify with the monkey, but to observe its antics with detached amusement. And there's something tremendously liberating in recognizing the social origins of our inner voice. Because once you see that your thoughts are not entirely your own, that they're a collection of internalized conversations, cultural assumptions, and learned responses, you can begin to hold them more lightly. You can begin to ask, is this thought really mine? Does it serve me? Is it even true? You can start to discriminate between the useful aspects of your conditioning and the harmful ones. And most importantly, you can begin to see that you are not obligated to believe everything you think. Just because a thought appears in your head doesn't mean it's true, or important, or worthy of attention. It may simply be an old recording, playing one more time. This is what the Buddhists mean by non-attachment to thoughts. Not suppressing them or fighting them, but recognizing their constructed nature and therefore not being tyrannized by them. It's rather like watching clouds pass across the sky. You don't try to stop the clouds, nor do you run after them. You simply observe their passing, knowing that they are not the sky itself. Your thoughts, too, are merely passing clouds in the vast sky of your awareness. Now, I've always been fascinated by the Eastern approaches to this puzzle of consciousness, particularly those found in Zen Buddhism and Taoism. They offer us such a refreshingly different perspective from our Western habits of thought. In Zen, there is a wonderful concept called no mind, or mushin in Japanese. It doesn't mean the absence of consciousness, but rather consciousness without the cluttering activity of the ego mind. It's the state a master archer enters when releasing the arrow, or a master painter when the brush seems to move by itself. There's a famous Zen story about a centipede who was asked how he coordinated all his 100 legs. The moment he started thinking about it, he became paralyzed and couldn't walk at all. This is a perfect metaphor for what happens when the analyzing mind interferes with the natural functioning of consciousness. The Zen masters developed a practice called Zazen, or sitting meditation. But unlike Western forms of meditation that often involve concentration on an object or idea, Zazen is about sitting with no goal, no intention, no attempt to control the mind. Just sitting, just being. When a thought arises, you neither follow it nor suppress it. You simply acknowledge its presence and let it pass, like watching a boat appear on the horizon and then sail away again without feeling any need to jump aboard. What the Zen practitioners discovered through this seemingly simple practice was profound. When you stop identifying with the voice in your head, when you cease believing that you are your thoughts, something extraordinary happens. The boundaries between self and other, between subject and object, begin to dissolve. This is what they call satori, or awakening the direct experiential realization that your true nature is not the separate self constructed by thought, but something far more vast and interconnected. The Taoists approach this from a slightly different angle. They speak of the Tao, the way, which cannot be spoken of or conceptualized. As Lao Tzu famously said, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The moment you try to capture it in words or concepts, you've already lost it. For the Taoist, the chattering mind, what they call the monkey mind, is not your enemy to be conquered, but simply a natural function that has been allowed to dominate inappropriately. Like a servant who has forgotten his place and now acts as if he were the master of the house. The goal is not to silence the servant, but to restore the proper order. To remember who is truly in charge. And the true master, in the Taoist view, is not another voice, not a superego or higher self, but the silent awareness that precedes all voices. The Tao Te Ching says, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." This isn't an anti-intellectual stance, but a recognition that genuine understanding transcends conceptual thought. It's the difference between reading a menu and tasting the food, between reading about swimming and actually diving into the water. What I find most valuable in both these traditions is their emphasis on direct experience rather than belief or theory. They offer practices, not doctrines. They don't ask you to believe anything, but rather to look for yourself, to examine your own consciousness with patient attention and see what's really there. And what they both point to, in their different ways, is that the voice in your head is not your deepest identity. It's a surface phenomenon, like waves on the ocean. Useful, certainly, but no more you than your heartbeat or your digestion. The true you, if we can even use such a term, is the awareness in which all phenomena, including thoughts, appear. It's the knowing, not the known. The seeing, not the seen. And this brings us to perhaps the most radical implication of Eastern thought, that this deepest level of awareness might not be personal at all. That your consciousness and my consciousness might be like two waves on the same ocean, apparently separate from a limited perspective, but in reality manifestations of a single underlying reality. As the Upanishads put it, Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. Your true nature is not separate from the ultimate nature of reality itself. Now, let's be very clear about something. I'm not suggesting that thinking is bad, or that we should try to stop the voice in our head. That would be like saying digestion is bad and we should try to stop our stomachs from working. The problem isn't thinking itself, but our relationship to thinking. You see, thinking is a marvelous tool. It allows us to plan, to remember, to create, to solve problems. Without conceptual thought, we couldn't build bridges or compose symphonies or develop vaccines. We couldn't even have this conversation. But in the West, we've developed a peculiar relationship with this tool. We've come to worship it, to identify with it completely, to believe that it's the core of our being. It's as if we've decided that the most important thing about a carpenter is his hammer. And this over-identification with thought has led to a kind of tyranny. For many of us, the voice in our head never stops. It chatters away constantly, commenting, judging, reminiscing, worrying, planning. And we think this is normal, even necessary. But is it? Is this constant internal monologue really essential to our functioning? Or might it actually be an impediment to our deepest well-being? Consider, when are you most happy, most fulfilled, most vibrantly alive? Is it when you're lost in thought, when the voice is chattering away 19 to the dozen? Or is it when you're completely absorbed in something in nature, in art, in sport, in love, when the voice momentarily falls silent and you're simply present to what is? Most people, if they're honest, will admit it's the latter. The moments of pure presence, of absorption, are the moments when we feel most alive, most real. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls this state flow, and his research shows it's consistently associated with the deepest forms of human satisfaction. But here's the rub. You can't think your way to flow. In fact, excessive thinking is the primary barrier to entering this state. The moment you start thinking about being in flow, you're no longer in it. This points to something profound. There's a mode of consciousness available to us that doesn't depend on the voice in our head. A way of knowing that doesn't rely on words or concepts. A form of intelligence that's direct, intuitive, non-symbolic. The pianist doesn't need to name each note as he plays. The dancer doesn't need to verbally instruct her limbs. The master chef doesn't consult an internal recipe book for every pinch of salt. There's a knowing in the doing that transcends thought. This is what we might call embodied intelligence, as opposed to conceptual intelligence. And it's available to all of us all the time, if we would only stop drowning it out with our incessant internal chatter. So how do we break the tyranny of constant thinking? How do we restore thought to its proper role as a tool rather than a master? Well, we certainly don't do it by fighting against thought, by trying to forcibly silence the voice. That's just more thinking.